Forward, history is written by the victors, but it is built on the bones of the forgotten. By 1880, the Canadian Pacific Railway, a young nation's audacious dream, had conquered the prairies and was preparing to assault its final, most formidable barrier, the mountains of British Columbia. But before the Rockies there was the canyon, a place where the Fraser River, ancient and furious, had carved a passage so deep and violent that the local Nlaka'pamux people spoke of it with a mixture of reverence and fear. It was a place God had seemingly designed to be impassable. Into this chasm came the American contractor Andrew Onderdonk, a man with a lucrative government contract and a chillingly pragmatic solution to an impossible problem. The problem was not just the vertical granite walls and the raging torrent below. It was the cost, both in money and in lives. To solve it, Onderdonk imported an army. Over 15,000 men were brought from the impoverished villages of Guangdong province in China. A workforce paid a third of what white laborers earned and assigned tasks that no one else would do. They became the human spiders of the canyon, lowered on flimsy ropes with baskets of unstable dynamite to blast ledges into cliffs that offered no footholds. They lived in squalid, segregated camps, their lives governed by the company's ledger and the constant threat of a misplaced charge, a falling rock, or the indifferent, churning water below. The official record states that for every mile of track laid through the canyon, at least one Chinese worker died. The unofficial tally, whispered in the camps, was far, far higher. Their graves are the railway itself. This is the story of that brutal, bloody passage. It is not a tale of engineering triumph, but of human cost. It is the story of a Scottish engineer, tasked with imposing order on a landscape of chaos, of a Chinese headman, caught between the lives of his countrymen and the demands of his paymasters, and of a Nlaka'pamux woman, witnessing her world being erased by the iron road and the ghosts it left in its wake. It is the story of the Fraser Canyon, a war waged not against a foreign army, but against the very bones of the earth, a war whose casualties were buried, uncounted and forgotten, deep in the shadow of the railway. Chapter 1. The Dragon's Maw. Alastair MacLeod first laid eyes on the Fraser Canyon not as an engineer, but as a penitent. Standing on the deck of a rickety paddle, steamer churning its way up the furious river, he felt the gorge rising around him not as a challenge, but as a judgment. The cliffs, sheer and black and slick with mist, were the walls of a colossal, water-filled tomb. The roar of the river was a constant, deafening accusation. He was a man who had built bridges over peaceful Scottish lochs and gentle English streams. This was a different beast entirely. This was a place where God had lost his temper. They call this part Hell's Gate. A fellow passenger shouted over the din, a grizzled prospector whose face was a road map of failed ambitions. The river narrows to 100 feet. Water gets backed up, goes mad. Sucks down anything that gets too close. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the churning water. You with the railway. Alastair nodded, the gesture tight. I'm the new section engineer. The title felt absurd, a child's boast in the face of such primordial power. His reputation for meticulous, cost-effective design had earned him this post, this exile. After the Tay Bridge disaster, where his mentor's flawed design had collapsed in a winter storm, killing 75, any engineer associated with the project was tainted. Alastair's own calculations had warned of the bridge's weakness, but he had been too junior, too timid, to press the point. His silence had cost him his career in Britain. The Canadian Pacific Railway, desperate for qualified men, was his only path back from professional ruin. As the steamer rounded a bend, he saw it. The first true evidence of the railway, a crude camp clung to a narrow ledge, a precarious beachhead in the war against the cliff, and from the cliff face itself, suspended on ropes that looked like spiders' silk, hung a dozen figures. They were small, dressed in blue cotton, their conical hats making them seem like strange, exotic fungi growing on the rock. They were the Chinese. He watched, mesmerized, as one of the men, dangling hundreds of feet above the river, swung a hammer, driving a steel drill into the granite. Another man beside him would then place a small, brown stick into the hole and light a fuse. Then, with a terrifying, casual grace, they would signal to be hauled up, scrambling away from the charge just moments before it detonated with a sharp crack, sending a shower of rock into the river below. It was a ballet of insanity, a daily dance with death performed for $1 a day. A few hundred yards downstream, on a slightly wider, cleared section of the future track bed, another man watched the same scene with a very different eye. His name was Huang Jin, though the white foreman called him Johnny. He was a headman, a labor contractor from Kaiping, and the men on those ropes were his responsibility. They were his kin, his neighbors, the sons of men he had known his whole life. He had convinced them to follow him across the Gold Mountain with promises of wealth. He had not told them the wealth would be earned by dancing with ghosts at the edge of the world. He felt a constant, grinding pressure in his gut. It was the pressure of being caught between two inexorable forces. On one side were the white foremen, the low fans, who saw his men not as humans, but as units of labor on a balance sheet. They demanded speed, they cut corners on safety, and they docked pay for the slightest infraction. On the other side were his own men, who looked to him for protection, for fair treatment, for a path home. He was their leader, but he was also their jailer, the man who took a percentage of their meager wages in exchange for navigating the treacherous world of the foreign devils. A young man, barely a boy, scrambled down from the rock face, his face pale. "The ropes are fraying, uncle," he said in their dialect, his voice trembling. The last rain weakened them. "They are not safe." Jin looked at the ropes, then at the American foreman, a brute of a man named Fletcher, who was overseeing the blasting. Jin approached him, bowing slightly, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Fletcher, ropes are no good. Need new ropes for safety." Fletcher spat on the ground. "New ropes cost money, Johnny, and time. The schedule is the schedule. If a man falls, there's 1,000 more in China waiting to take his place. Now get your boys back to work, or there's no pay today, for any of you." The calculus was that simple, that brutal. Jin stood for a moment, the foreman's casual cruelty a physical blow. He looked at the faces of his men, at their fear and their hope, and then back at the frayed ropes. He made his own calculation. He gave a slight nod to Fletcher, then turned to his men. "Work carefully," he said in a low voice. "The spirits of our ancestors are watching. Do not shame them with fear." It was all he could offer them, a prayer instead of a new rope. From the deck of the approaching steamer, Alastair MacLeod watched the scene through a spyglass. He couldn't hear the words, but he understood the grim pantomime, the Chinese worker's plea, the foreman's dismissive gesture, the headman's bowed acquiescence. He saw engineering not as a matter of blueprints and stress calculations, but as a brutal equation of human lives versus profit. It was the same equation that had brought down the Tay Bridge. He had crossed an ocean, but he had not escaped the ghost. It was here, too, dangling on a frayed rope, 100 feet above a river that devoured men's souls. And this time he was the one in charge. The silence, he knew, would be his. To own. Chapter 2. The Weight of a Name. Alastair's arrival at Camp 27 was met with the sullen indifference of a place that had already seen too many new bosses. The camp was a festering wound on the canyon wall, a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, crude log huts, and open latrines, all clinging to a narrow, man-made ledge. The air was thick with the smells of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acrid tang of dynamite. It was a place of brutal transience, where the only permanent residents were the river, the rock, and a pervasive sense of despair. His welcome was a brief, perfunctory meeting with Andrew Onderdonk himself. The chief contractor was a man who radiated an almost terrifying energy, his eyes constantly moving, calculating, assessing. He was a whirlwind of ambition and impatience, a man building an empire of rock and steel. He dispensed with pleasantries, unrolling a blueprint on a makeshift table. MacLeod, Onderdonk said, his voice a sharp staccato, "Glad to have you. Your reputation precedes you. You're a man who understands costs. The costs here are astronomical. We are behind schedule and over budget. Your job is simple. Get us back on track. I don't care how. Just do it." He pointed to a section of the blueprint, a treacherous curve known as the Cisco Bend. "This is your problem now. Solve it." The meeting was over. Alastair was left with a pat on the back from a junior engineer and a map of his section. His predecessor, he learned, had not been fired, but had suffered a nervous breakdown, a common euphemism for a man who had been broken by the sheer, relentless pressure of the canyon. Alastair's first act as section engineer was to walk the line, to see the problem not as a drawing, but as a physical reality. He found the foreman, Fletcher, overseeing a crew of Chinese workers who were clearing rockfall from a recent blast. Alastair introduced himself, his gaze falling on the ropes being used by the men working above. They were visibly worn, caked with mud and frayed in several places. "Mr. Fletcher," Alastair began, his voice tight, "those ropes are a disgrace. They're a fatal accident waiting to happen. Replace them, immediately." Fletcher, a man accustomed to absolute authority over his crew, bristled. "And who's going to pay for them, Mr. MacLeod? They come out of my budget." "Onderdonk is screaming about costs as it is. These ropes will hold. They always do. They will hold until they don't," Alastair retorted, his voice cold. "And when they break, the inquiry will find that I, the section engineer, saw the danger and did nothing. I will not have my name on a death certificate. The cost of a new rope is nothing compared to the cost of a delay for an investigation. Replace them, that is an order. The mention of an inquiry, of a delay, of his own name being on a report, this was language Fletcher understood. It was the calculus of liability. With a sullen, resentful glare, the foreman turned and barked at a subordinate to fetch new ropes from the supply shed. Alastair had won his first battle, not with an appeal to morality, but with a threat to the schedule. The exchange had not gone unnoticed. Huang Jin, who had been supervising the rock-clearing crew, had watched with a quiet, intense focus. He had seen the new engineer, the low, fan with the sad eyes, challenge the foreman. He had seen the foreman back down. It was a small thing, a new set of ropes, but in a world where the lives of his men were treated as disposable, it was a seismic event. For the first time, a man in a position of power had valued a Chinese life at more than zero. Later that day, as Alastair was surveying the treacherous geology of the Cisco Bend, Jin approached him. He bowed, his hands clasped respectfully. "Mr. MacLeod saw," he said, his English careful and formal. "Thank you, for the ropes." Alastair was taken aback. He had not expected to be thanked. "It's a matter of safety," he said, a little awkwardly, "and efficiency. A dead worker is an inefficient worker." He used the cold language of the company, the language he had used with Fletcher, because it was safer than admitting the real reason, that the sight of the men on the frayed ropes had reminded him of the broken iron on the Tay Bridge, of the weight of a silence he had sworn he would never carry again. Jin, however, heard what was not said. He was a man who had spent his life reading the subtle currents of power, of deciphering the true meaning behind the words of men who held his fate in their hands. He saw the flicker of something human in the engineer's eyes, a weariness that went beyond the struggles of the railway. "A good name is worth more than gold," Jin said, quoting a proverb from his village. He bowed again and walked away, leaving Alastair alone on the ledge. The words echoed in Alastair's mind. A good name, his own name, MacLeod, had been a source of pride, a name associated with generations of Scottish architects and builders. Now it was a name whispered with pity and suspicion in the engineering halls of London and Edinburgh. Here, in this god-forsaken canyon, he was just another railway boss, but the Chinese headman, a man whose own name he did not even know, had seen him. He had seen his struggle, and in that brief, unexpected moment of human connection, Alastair felt a strange and unwelcome seed of responsibility begin to take root. He was not just here to save his career, he was here to save his name. And he was beginning to realize, with a dawning sense of dread, that the cost of that salvation might be far higher than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 3, The Unseen Bridge. Alastair's small act of replacing the ropes had an unintended consequence. It opened a channel. It was not a formal channel, but a subtle, unspoken one. Huang Jin, the headman, began to approach Alastair directly, bypassing the hostile foreman. He would appear at Alastair's side as he surveyed the line, a silent, respectful presence, and would point out things the blueprints never could. He would show him where the rock was rotten, prone to splintering under the blast. He would indicate where the winter's ice clung longest, creating hidden, treacherous slicks. He spoke of the mountain as if it were a living thing, with moods and weaknesses. "This rock is angry," Jin would say, his English still a careful, constructed thing. "Many small blasts are better than one big one. It does not like to be woken up all at once." Alastair, a man of science and mathematics, was initially skeptical of this geological poetry. But he was also a pragmatist. He listened, and he began to test Jin's advice. He ordered a series of smaller, sequenced charges on a section of rock Jin had described as angry. The result was a cleaner break, less rockfall, and a safer ledge. The work was faster, more efficient. It was a language Onderdonk understood. The foreman, Fletcher, grumbled at the new, more complex procedures, but the results were undeniable. Production on their section increased by 10%. This fragile, clandestine partnership was built in the moments between the chaos. It was built on a shared language of competence. Alastair learned that Jin had been a stonemason in his home province, that he understood the art of finding the hidden stresses in a block of stone, of cleaving it with a single, well-placed blow. Jin, in turn, began to understand the engineer's drawings, the strange, magical lines that predicted a future carved in rock. He would ask questions, his finger tracing a contour on the blueprint, and Alastair would explain the principles of gradient and load, bearing, finding a strange satisfaction in teaching this quiet, intelligent man. But their alliance, however productive, was a dangerous one. It was an unseen bridge built across a chasm of racial hostility, and the ground on both sides was unstable. Jin's own people were suspicious. By speaking with the white engineer, by adopting his methods, was he becoming one of them? Was he trading their safety for the company's favor? The other headmen, who ruled their crews through a combination of fear and tradition, saw Jin's influence with the new engineer as a threat to their own. For Alastair, the danger was more immediate. He was upsetting the brutal but established order of the camp. The white foremen, men like Fletcher, saw their authority being undermined. Their power came from their absolute control over the Chinese workforce, a control built on fear, ignorance, and the language barrier. Alastair, by communicating directly with Jin, was punching a hole in that barrier. He was treating a Chinese worker as a colleague, an expert, a man. In the toxic ecosystem of the Fraser Canyon, this was a radical, unforgivable act. The breaking point came not from the rock, but from the river. The work had reached a small but treacherous tributary, a torrent of white water that plunged into the main canyon. A temporary wooden trestle bridge was needed to cross it. Alastair designed it himself, a simple, sturdy structure. The construction was assigned to a crew of white carpenters, considered more skilled than the Chinese for such work. Alastair was called away to another section for 2 days. When he returned, he found the bridge nearly complete, but he saw immediately that it was wrong. The main support trusses were not properly anchored to the bedrock. The carpenters, in a hurry, had set them in the loose, shoaly soil at the river's edge. The bridge was unsafe. A heavy supply train, or even a sudden surge in the river, could bring it down. He found the lead carpenter, a man named Henderson, and pointed out the flaw. "This is unacceptable," Alastair said, his voice shaking with a cold fury. "You've compromised the entire structure. It has to be dismantled and rebuilt." Henderson, a proud and belligerent man, flushed with anger. "Dismantle it. That's a week's work. The bridge is fine. It'll hold. You and your fancy drawings don't know everything. We're the ones who do the building here. You will rebuild it, or I will have you fired," Alastair stated, his voice flat. "Is that so?" Henderson sneered. "Well, Fletcher and me, we've already sent a report to Onderdonk about you, about your special relationship with the Chinaman, about how you're slowing down the work with your safety concerns, about how you're putting the word of a yellow man over the judgment of your own kind. Who do you think he's going to believe, MacLeod? You, the man with the black mark on his name?" Or us, the threat was clear. They had laid a trap for him. The faulty bridge was the bait. If he insisted on rebuilding it, they would use the delay to get him fired. If he allowed it to stand, and it collapsed, the blame and the blood would be on his hands. He was caught, his own words about his name on a death certificate thrown back in his face. He stood in silence for a long moment, the roar of the river filling his ears. He looked at the flawed bridge, a monument to incompetence and malice. He thought of the Tay Bridge, of the storm, of the train plunging into the icy water. He thought of the weight of a silence that had haunted him for years. He would not carry it again. "Very well," Alastair said, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned to Jin, who had been watching the confrontation from a distance. "Mr. Huang," he said, using the headman's proper name for the first time, "your men are masons, are they not?" Jin nodded, his eyes cautious. "Good," Alastair said. "I have a new job for them. I want you to build a stone abutment, here and here." He kicked at the unstable ground where the main trusses were set. "A solid foundation. We will not rebuild the bridge. We will reinforce it. We will make it stronger than my original design, and we will do it in 2 days." It was a brilliant, audacious move. He was not just correcting the flaw. He was improving upon his own work, using the skills of the very men the white carpenters despised. He was turning their trap into a showcase for his partnership with Jin. Henderson and Fletcher stood, speechless, their plan crumbling around them. Alastair had not just called their bluff. He had raised the stakes, and he had bet everything on the competence of a Chinese stonemason and the strength of their unseen bridge. Chapter 4. The Price of Water. What followed was a marvel of quiet, disciplined industry. Huang Jin's crew of masons, men who had built walls and canals in the fertile river valleys of Guangdong, fell upon the task with a silent, ferocious energy. They worked with an almost telepathic understanding, their movements economical and precise. They gathered the blasted rock from the surrounding slopes, their eyes and hammers finding the natural cleavage lines, splitting massive boulders into usable blocks. They worked without shouting, communicating with a series of subtle gestures and low, tonal calls, a language of stone and purpose. Alastair watched, his initial gamble solidifying into a profound respect. This was not the brute, forced labor of the grading crews. This was artistry. Jin was the conductor, orchestrating the placement of every stone, ensuring the fit was perfect, the balance true. Alastair's blueprints gave them the dimensions, but it was their ancient, ingrained knowledge of stonework that gave the structure its soul. They were not just building an abutment, they were raising a monument to their own competence, right under the noses of the men who despised them. The white carpenters, led by Henderson, stood by and watched, their faces a mixture of sullen resentment and grudging awe. Their own shoddy work was being buttressed and saved by the very men they considered their inferiors. Every perfectly placed stone was a silent rebuke. Fletcher, the foreman, stalked the site like a caged wolf, furious at the turn of events but powerless to stop it. Alastair had given a direct order, and the work was proceeding at a blistering pace. There was nothing he could do but wait for Onderdonk's judgment. They finished the work in 36 hours. 2 massive, beautifully constructed stone abutments now stood at the base of the trestle bridge, anchoring it firmly to the bedrock. The structure was now immensely stronger than Alastair's original design. It was a fortress. It was a masterpiece. It was also a declaration of war. The victory, however, was short-lived. The camp's delicate social ecosystem had been irrevocably disturbed. The racial tensions, which had always simmered beneath the surface, now began to boil over. The white workers, their pride wounded and their dominance challenged, retaliated with a campaign of petty, vicious harassment aimed at the Chinese crews. Tools went missing, rations were spoiled, fights broke out over imagined slights. The flashpoint, as it so often did in the camps, came over something essential and scarce: clean water. The only source of safe drinking water was a small, clear stream that trickled down the mountainside into a series of barrels. By an unspoken rule, the white workers had first access. The Chinese were forced to wait, often finding the barrels nearly empty, and were forced to drink the silty, dangerous water from the main river. Sickness, dysentery, typhoid, was rampant in the Chinese camp, a quiet, constant killer that the company doctor, overworked and prejudiced, largely ignored. One sweltering afternoon, a young Chinese worker, his face pale with fever, was refused access to the barrels by a group of Henderson's carpenters. "Wait your turn, Chinaman," one of them sneered, kicking over the boy's bucket. "The river is good enough for your kind." Jin, who was nearby, saw the act. The quiet patience he had cultivated for years finally snapped. He walked over, his expression a mask of cold fury. He did not speak to the carpenters. He simply picked up the boy's bucket, filled it from the barrel, and handed it to him. He then stood before the barrel, a silent, immovable guard. It was a direct challenge. The carpenters, emboldened by their numbers, surrounded him. "Getting brave, are we, Johnny," Henderson growled. "Think you're a big man now, friends with the engineer." He shoved Jin hard. "This is our water, our camp." The shove was a spark in a powder keg. In an instant, the clearing was a roiling mass of bodies. Chinese and white workers, their resentments boiling over, clashed in a brutal, chaotic melee. It was not a fight, it was a riot. Men fought with fists, with shovels, with rocks. The air was filled with shouts, with curses in a dozen languages, with the sickening thud of blows landing. Alastair, alerted by the noise, came running. He plunged into the heart of the riot, trying to restore order, his shouts for peace lost in the din. He saw Jin, his face bleeding, trying to pull his men back. He saw Henderson, his face contorted with hate, swinging a pickaxe handle. He saw the fragile order of his section, the progress he had made, dissolving into a bloody racial war. The riot was finally broken up by the arrival of the camp's ad hoc police force, a group of armed guards who waded in with clubs, beating both sides into submission with an impartial brutality. The clearing was left a wreck, littered with wounded, groaning men. The barrels of clean water lay overturned, their precious contents spilled into the mud. The next morning the judgment came. Andrew Onderdonk arrived, his face like a thundercloud. He had received Fletcher and Henderson's report. Now he had a riot on his hands. He stood before the assembled foremen, his eyes blazing. "This section is a disaster," he roared. "Productivity is down. We have a race riot, and it all seems to lead back to you, MacLeod." He turned his furious gaze on Alastair. "I sent you here to solve problems, not create them. You have undermined your foremen, you have shown favoritism to the Chinese, and you have lost control of your men. Your experiment in cooperation is over. The riot was a result of the unfair treatment of the Chinese workers," Alastair argued, his voice steady despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. With a dispute over the water, Onderdonk cut him off. "I am not interested in the price of water. I am interested in the price of a mile of track, and your methods are proving too costly." He made his decision. "Fletcher, you are in charge of this section, effective immediately. Henderson, you are promoted to sub-foreman. MacLeod, you are reassigned. There is a survey team working in the upper valley. It is a quiet, lonely job. It should suit you. You are to be out of this camp by noon." It was a public humiliation, a demotion, an exile. He was being sent away from the real work, his authority stripped, his name tarnished once again. As he walked back to his tent to gather his few belongings, he passed Jin, who was being marched, along with a dozen other Chinese workers, to the camp's makeshift jail. Their punishment for the riot would be a week's lost wages and a brutal beating. Jin met Alastair's eye. There was no blame in his gaze, only a deep, profound, and shared sense of defeat. The unseen bridge they had built had collapsed, and in the ruins the old, brutal order had been restored. Chapter 5. The Nlaka'pamux. Exile had a name, the Anderson River Valley. Alastair's new posting was a quiet, lonely purgatory. His job was to survey a potential branch line, a project he knew would never be funded. It was a make-work task, a way for Onderdonk to get rid of him without the paperwork of firing a qualified engineer. He spent his days with a small crew, hacking through the dense, dripping forest, his theodolite and measuring chains his only companions. The roar of the canyon was replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. It was a silence that gave him too much time to think. He was a failure. He had come to Canada to rebuild his name, but he had only tarnished it. Further, he had tried to bring a measure of decency to an indecent place, and he had been punished for it. He had tried to build a bridge of respect between two cultures, and it had collapsed into a riot. He had left Jin and his men to the mercies of Fletcher, a man who had none. The weight of this new silence was heavier than the last. His only contact with the outside world was a weekly supply pack brought by a young Nlaka'pamux woman named Kimi. She was from the village of Spuzum, a settlement that had existed at the confluence of the Fraser and Anderson rivers for 1,000 years before the railway had blasted its way into their world. She moved through the forest with a silent, fluid grace that made Alastair and his clumsy crew seem like intruders from another species. She was quiet, her face a mask of careful neutrality, her eyes holding the deep, ancient sorrow of a people watching their world die. At first, their interactions were limited to a few words of heavily accented English. But one afternoon she found him staring at the remains of a kekuli, a traditional pit house, its circular shape barely visible under a blanket of moss and ferns. "My grandmother was born in this house," Kimi said, her voice soft. It was the first time she had ever volunteered a personal detail. Alastair, surprised, asked her about it, and for the first time she spoke. She told him of a time, not so long ago, when the river was not a barrier, but a highway, a source of life. She spoke of the great salmon runs, so thick you could almost walk across their backs. She spoke of the mountain goats, of the berry patches, of a world that was a delicate, intricate web of relationships, a web the railway was now tearing to shreds. "Your railway has scared away the goats," she said, her voice devoid of accusation, stating it as a simple, tragic fact. "The blasting has changed the path of the rockslides, and the salmon, they do not come as they once did. They are disturbed by the shaking of the earth. My people are hungry." She also spoke of the Chinese workers. "They are not like you," she said. "They are quiet. They do not get drunk and fight, and they understand the land. Some of them come to us for herbs when they are sick. They know the company doctor will not help them. They are like us, caught in the teeth of your iron dragon." Through these quiet conversations, Alastair began to see the canyon in a new light. He had seen it as a geological problem, a series of obstacles to be overcome with dynamite and steel. Kimi showed him that it was a home, a living, breathing entity that was being wounded, perhaps mortally. He had seen the Chinese workers as a labor issue, a problem of management and efficiency. Kimi showed him that they were a displaced people, struggling to survive, just like her own. One day, Kimi arrived with his supplies, her face grim. "There has been a great accident," she said, "at the Cisco Bend, a big blast. It went wrong. Many of the quiet men are dead." Alastair's blood ran cold. The Cisco Bend, the section he had been working on with Jin. He knew immediately, with a sickening certainty, what had happened. Fletcher, in his arrogance and his haste, had ignored the careful, sequenced blasting patterns they had developed. He had gone back to using single, massive charges, the brute force method that was faster, but infinitely more dangerous. He had woken the angry rock. "I have to go back," Alastair said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "There is nothing you can do," Kimi said softly. "It is over." "No," Alastair insisted, a new hard resolve forming in his mind. "I am the section engineer. It is my responsibility. My name is on that section." He looked at her, at this woman who had shown him the true cost of the railway. "Will you guide me through the forest? It will be faster than following the line." Kimi studied his face for a long moment. She saw a change in him. The haunted, defeated man was gone. In his place was a man who had found a purpose, a man who had finally accepted the weight of his own name. She gave a single, slow nod. They travelled for a day and a night, moving through the dense, trackless wilderness. Kimi led him with an unerring sense of direction, a knowledge of the land that was as deep and intuitive as his own knowledge of mathematics. As they drew closer to the canyon, the silence of the forest was replaced by a familiar, terrible sound, the sound of a catastrophe, the shouts of men, the clang of metal, the groans of the wounded. They emerged onto a scene of utter devastation. A massive section of the cliff face at the Cisco Bend had collapsed. The premature blast had triggered a landslide, burying the work site, the tracks, and the men who had been working there. It was a graveyard of rock and earth. Rescue crews were frantically digging at the rubble, a hopeless task. Alastair saw Fletcher, his face pale with shock and fear, trying to direct the rescue. He saw Onderdonk, who had just arrived, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. This was a disaster not just of human life, but of time and money. The line was blocked. The schedule was in ruins. Alastair ignored them. He searched the faces of the survivors, the wounded Chinese workers who were being tended to by their own countrymen at the edge of the chaos. He was looking for one face. He found him lying on a makeshift stretcher, his leg crushed by a boulder, his face slick with sweat and pain. It was Jin. Alastair knelt beside him. Jin's eyes fluttered open. He recognized the engineer, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. The rock was angry. He whispered. "I'm sorry," Alastair said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "I should have been here." Just then, Onderdonk stormed over, his face livid. "MacLeod, what in God's name are you doing here? I exiled you. This disaster, this is Fletcher's incompetence." Alastair stood up, turning to face the contractor. The fear, the deference, the desire to please, it was all gone, burned away by the tragedy. He was no longer a disgraced engineer trying to save his career. He was a man who had finally found his voice. "No, Mr. Onderdonk," he said, his voice ringing with a cold, clear authority. "This is not Fletcher's disaster. This is your disaster. This is the result of a system that values schedules over lives, that rewards brutality and punishes competence. This is the price of your railway. And I will not be silent about it." He looked from Onderdonk's stunned face to the devastation around him, and then to Kimi, who stood watching from the edge of the clearing, a silent witness to his transformation. He had come to the canyon a penitent, seeking to save his own name. He knew now that his redemption lay not in building a railway, but in telling the truth of its human cost. The silence was over. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. Alastair's defiance hung in the air, as shocking and explosive as the blast that had caused the disaster. In the rigid hierarchy of the railway, it was an act of open rebellion. Andrew Onderdonk, a man accustomed to absolute obedience, stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into a cold, dangerous fury. "You are finished, MacLeod," he said, his voice low and venomous, "and not just on this railway. You will never work again on any continent. I will personally see to it that your name is a byword for insubordination and failure." "My name is already a byword for failure, Mr. Onderdonk," Alastair replied, his voice calm and steady. "The failure to speak up, the failure to prevent a disaster. I have lived with that once. I will not live with it again. The fault for this massacre, lies with your methods. With your foreman, Fletcher, who ignored safe blasting procedures. With your entire system, which treats these men," he gestured to the wounded Chinese workers, "as less than human." He took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. There will be an inquiry, a government inquiry, and I will testify. I will provide my logs, my reports, my designs. I will detail how the pursuit of profit at the expense of safety led directly to this. I will give them the truth, and we will see whose name is ruined then. It was a breathtaking gamble. Alastair was leveraging the one thing Onderdonk feared more than construction delays: political scandal. The Canadian Pacific Railway was not just a private enterprise. It was a national project, funded by the public purse and scrutinized by the press. A public inquiry, detailing the horrific loss of Chinese lives due to negligence, could be a catastrophe for the company, threatening its government subsidies and its public image. Onderdonk, for the first time, was silent. He was a brilliant and ruthless calculator of risk, and he was calculating now. He looked at the devastation, at the dozens of dead and dying Chinese workers. He looked at Fletcher, who was already trying to slink away into the background, and he looked at Alastair, a man with nothing left to lose, a man who had finally found a conviction stronger than his ambition. He saw that the engineer was not bluffing. "What do you want, MacLeod?" Onderdonk asked, his voice stripped of its fury, now cold and pragmatic. It was the voice of a man negotiating a treaty. "I want 3 things," Alastair said, the demands clear and ready in his mind. "First, Fletcher is to be fired, publicly, for incompetence and negligence. The blame for this must be placed where it belongs. Second, Huang Jin is to be promoted to sub-foreman. He will oversee the Chinese crews directly, with the authority to ensure their safety and the proper implementation of blasting procedures. He will answer to me, because third, I am taking back control of this section, effective immediately." The audacity of the demands was stunning. He was not just asking for his job back, he was demanding a fundamental restructuring of the power dynamic in the camp. He was asking for a Chinese worker to be given a position of real authority, a move that was unheard of, that would shatter the racial hierarchy of the entire railway. Onderdonk stared at him, his mind weighing the costs. A public inquiry would be a disaster. Firing a single incompetent foreman was easy, but promoting a Chinese worker, it would cause an uproar among the white crews. Yet the alternative was worse, and Alastair, for all his trouble-making, was a brilliant engineer. If anyone could clear this mess and get the line moving again, it was him. And if giving the Chinese a foreman of their own would increase their efficiency and prevent future disasters, then perhaps it was a cost worth paying. "Done," Onderdonk said, the single word sealing the pact. He turned to a subordinate. "Get Fletcher. Tell him to collect his pay. I want him out of this canyon by nightfall." He then looked at Alastair, his expression a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "You have your victory, MacLeod. Now clean up this mess. The government is expecting a railway, not a graveyard. And if you fail, if there is one more major incident on this section, I will personally crucify you." With that, Onderdonk turned and strode away, leaving Alastair standing in the center of his shattered, chaotic, and newly acquired kingdom. The weeks that followed were a blur of frantic, exhausting work. Under Alastair's command, and with Jin, his leg now splinted and bound, his authority absolute, directing the Chinese crews, they cleared the landslide. It was a new kind of work site. The racial tensions did not vanish, but they were suppressed by a new, shared sense of purpose and a clear, unyielding chain of command. Jin proved to be a natural leader, his quiet competence earning the respect of his own men and the grudging acceptance of the white crews. For the first time, the Chinese workers had a voice, an advocate, a man who spoke their language and understood their struggles. Alastair, for his part, was transformed. The haunted, hesitant man was gone, replaced by a leader of quiet, confident authority. He worked tirelessly, sleeping only a few hours a night, his mind constantly engaged in the complex, 3-dimensional chess game of clearing the slide and rebuilding the line. He had found his purpose not in the abstract beauty of design, but in the messy, complicated, and deeply human business of getting the job done, safely and correctly. One evening, as the line was finally nearing completion, Kimi appeared at his tent. She had been a quiet, constant presence during the reconstruction, her people helping to supply the camp with fresh food, her knowledge of the local herbs proving more effective than the company doctor's limited medicines. She carried a small woven basket. "My grandmother sends this," she said, a gift. Inside the basket was a beautifully carved wooden salmon. "It is a symbol of resilience," she explained, "of returning, of a debt being paid." Alastair took the carving, the wood smooth and warm in his hand. He understood. The debt was not just his, but the railway's. It was a debt of blood, of broken promises, of a world destroyed. It could never be fully repaid. But in this small, fragile alliance between a Scottish engineer, a Chinese stonemason, and an Nlaka'pamux woman, something new had been built. It was not a railway. It was a bridge of shared humanity, built over a river of grief, strong enough, perhaps, to bear the weight of a new beginning. He looked out at the canyon, at the raw, fresh scar of the railway line cutting through the ancient landscape. The work was not over. The cost was immense. But his name, Alastair MacLeod, was no longer a name of shame. It was a name that had been tested in the Dragon's Maw, and had not been found wanting. It was a good name. And in the heart of the Fraser Canyon, that was a victory more profound than the conquest of any mountain. Epilogue. The last spike of the Canadian Pacific Railway was driven at Prejudiced, British Columbia, on November 7, 1885. It was a muted affair, far from the grand celebration the politicians had envisioned. The railway was built, but the cost, measured in money and in lives, had been staggering. Of the more than 15,000 Chinese laborers who had toiled on the British Columbia section, it is estimated that at least 600 perished, though many historians believe the true number is 3 or 4 times that high. They died from accidents, from disease, from malnutrition, and from the brutal cold. Their names were not recorded. Their families were never compensated. They were the ghosts of the Iron Road. Andrew Onderdonk completed his contract and became a wealthy man, his name celebrated in the annals of Canadian engineering. The scandals, the deaths, the riots, they were all footnotes in the grand narrative of national unity and progress. He went on to build other railways, other monuments to his ambition, and died a respected captain of industry. Alastair MacLeod stayed on with the CPR for another 2 years, his section of the Fraser Canyon known as the safest and most efficiently run on the entire line. His partnership with Huang Jin became a quiet legend among the workers, a testament to a different way of building. But Alastair never sought another promotion. He had no taste for the corporate hierarchy. When the line was finished, he resigned. He used the money he had saved to buy a small plot of land in the Anderson River Valley, not far from the Nlaka'pamux village of Spuzum. He never built another bridge of steel, but he spent the rest of his life building other, more lasting connections. He worked with Kimi and her people, helping them navigate the bewildering and often hostile world of the Canadian government. He recorded their stories, their language, their knowledge of the land, preserving a world that the railway had tried to erase. He died in 1928 and was buried in a small, unmarked grave overlooking the river, his name known only to the people he had served. Huang Jin, his leg permanently damaged, but his spirit unbroken, became one of the most respected Chinese leaders in British Columbia. After the railway was completed, he did not return to China. He stayed, helping the thousands of now unemployed Chinese workers find new lives in a country that did not want them. He organized mutual aid societies. He fought against the discriminatory head tax that was imposed on Chinese immigrants, and he built a new community in the burgeoning city of Vancouver. He never saw his home village of Kaiping again, but he brought a piece of it to Gold Mountain, planting the seeds of a new Chinese, Canadian identity. His descendants still live in Vancouver, a testament to his resilience and his courage. The Fraser Canyon remains a place of terrifying beauty. The railway still clings to its walls, a testament to the audacity of its builders. The river still roars through Hell's Gate, its voice a constant reminder of the power of nature. And if you listen closely, on a quiet night, you can almost hear the ghosts, the echoes of the dynamite, the shouts of the foreman, the silent, determined labor of thousands of men who built a nation and were forgotten. They are the true foundation of the Iron Road. Their story is the story of the river's edge.